So my name is Scott Miller. I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm going to be your guide for this class for our conditional logic crash course. Um, I've been teaching LSAT classes and tutoring for about 10 years. I've worked for a couple different prep companies and tutor on my own. Um, I've seen a lot of students struggle with conditional logic, which is maybe not surprising. I think it's pretty common for people to struggle. Some people struggle with it a little bit, some people struggle more than others. But it's pretty common for people to at least have to put a little bit of effort into understanding conditional logic and how it works on the LSAT. So the good news is that conditional logic is very learnable. Hopefully, even if you're struggling with it a little bit, you'll start to see that tonight a little bit, even if you are, if you have been having some trouble with it. So where this came from, where this conditional logic crash course came from, is a couple of years ago, several years ago, actually, I created a written guide to conditional logic to give my students as a handout. And what I did in this guide was I addressed some common misunderstandings. So there are some core concepts that people often don't understand, or concepts that many people find confusing when we start talking about conditional logic. And in particular, this guide I made, this little PDF I made, explained things that sometimes get glossed over. So, if you're reading a chapter on conditional logic in an LSAT prep book, or if you're doing an online lesson, there are certain basic ideas that often don't get discussed, or they don't get discussed in a lot of detail. And I think people sometimes take for granted that if you understand one thing, you're going to understand some of these other things. And that's not always the case. So what I created this conditional logic guide for is to help people understand some of these basic concepts and misunderstandings. And I think once you do that, a lot of other things start to fall into place. A lot of other things start to make sense. So this conditional logic crash course, this little online workshop we're doing tonight, is based on this guide. And here's what we're going to cover. Here's what we're going to talk about. So what is a conditional statement? That's what we'll start with. Why do we care? Why do we care about conditional logic? Why do you have to learn this if you want to, take the LSAT and go to law school? We're going to talk about some conditional logic errors, inferences that you can make based on conditional statements. And we'll talk a little bit about conditional language. So like indicator words, common indicator words that we see that indicate that there's some conditional logic going on in a sentence. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the more complex conditional statements that we see, what we call compound conditional statements. And that is our plan. So a little bit of housekeeping first. As you saw when you signed up for this free class tonight, I am going to be recording this. I'm probably going to put this on YouTube or somewhere like that. And so would love for you if you want to be on camera and use your mic, but we are going to be recording. So, if you get on camera or if you use your microphone, that's going to be in the recording. The chat window will not be included in the recording. So if you want to, put questions, if you don't want to be in the recording, but you want to put questions in the chat window, I will read the questions from the chat window, but that's going to be anonymous. And I will stick around for a few minutes after this is over too. So, if you have questions, but you don't want to ask questions while we're recording, I'll stick around for a few minutes after and you're welcome to ask questions then. As far as taking notes, it's another housekeeping thing. So I know a lot of people like to take notes. Sometimes that helps you remember things better if you're writing things down. The problem with taking notes is I think sometimes people are taking notes about one thing and then they're not listening to the next thing. And we're going to cover a lot of things. We're going to move pretty fast tonight. So I am going to send, after this is over, I'm going to send out a link to the recording so that you can go back and watch the recording again if you want. And also I'll send that PDF out, that handout that I just mentioned. I'm going to send that to everybody who's here tonight or signed up for the workshop. So another thing about tonight is we're not going to cover actual prep test questions. I'm not going to use actual, go over a bunch of LSAT questions like step by step. Because a lot of times as we start digging into LSAT questions, we could spend easily at least 15 minutes talking about one question, maybe more. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to cover as many concepts as we can. We're going to go through this stuff kind of as quickly as we can. cover a lot of concepts, but then if you understand these concepts, then you'll be able to go back and maybe review LSAT questions, LR questions that you've had trouble with. You'll be able to go back and do some drills and apply what we're talking about tonight to those actual LSAT questions, either ones you've already had trouble with or new ones that you're working on that involve conditional logic. All right. So what is a conditional statement? Let's start with that. What is it? So conditional statements tell us about things that must be true. Conditional statements describe a relationship between two things that will always exist, a relationship that always exists between two things. Sometimes conditional statements describe requirements, one thing that's required in order for another thing to happen. And, we often call these if-then statements, right? This is kind of the basic form of a conditional statement, is this if-then form. So, for example, maybe you're like, I don't know, maybe you're working, let's say you're working at a like one of those discount grocery stores, right? Where everything's really cheap. And maybe you're like the manager and you're, writing up a list of instructions for employees. And on the instructions, you write, if a can is dented, then the price will be discounted by 50%. So that's a conditional statement. We're saying that any can that is dented will always be discounted by 50%. So the thing to realize about when we're looking at these if-then statements on the LSAT, there are no exceptions. So when we talk about these if-then statements on the LSAT, they're very strong statements. No exceptions. They're not could-bes, they're not maybes, they're must-bes, relationships that always exist. So any can, in this example, any can that is dented will be discounted by 50%. And very often, what you'll see is we diagram these, or we use these little, this little shorthand when we talk about these conditional statements. So this is the way we would draw it. We would say dent, and then an arrow, and then 50%. And, there are different types of shorthand, different types of little, quick shorthand ways we use to express these. But the arrow, that little arrow between dent and 50% discount, means the then. The arrow means then. So we would read this basically the same way, right? If you're writing out the little shorthand version, the arrow means then. So we would say if dented, then 50% discount. All right. And feel free, if you have any questions, like I said, I'm going through this stuff kind of quick. So if you have any questions, you can put a question in the chat window or save them for later, whatever you like. But feel free to stop me too. If you want to stop me and ask a question, you're welcome to do that. Okay. So we talked about requirements a moment ago, right? So let's say, again, you're working in that discount grocery store and you say you're the manager, you're the owner, you're the boss. And so you send this message out to all your employees. You say, everyone who works the night shift must complete anti-zombie training. We want to learn how to protect ourselves from those zombies. Maybe this is a like discount grocery store in a horror movie. So again, we would write this as if-then. If you are working the night shift, then you must complete zombie training. So zombie training is the requirement, is the thing that is required, is the thing that must be true for anyone who is working on the night shift. So that's what we mean when we say that conditional statements sometimes describe requirements. And anytime we look at these conditional statements, we always say, if the thing on the left side happens, then the thing on the right side must happen also. If you work the night shift, then you must have the zombie training. It's a requirement. Going back to our last example, if a can is dented, then it must be true that that can will be discounted 50%. So why do we care? Why do we need to know this, right? This is a common question that people ask about a lot of things on the LSAT. Like, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to learn this to get into law school? Well, there's actually a really good reason for learning about conditional logic. There's a really good reason why the LSAT tests your understanding of conditional logic. Because basically, conditional statements are basically rules, right? Conditional statements are basically give us a rule. If a can is dented, then the price will be discounted by 50%. And, so an example you might see maybe in a lease, right? In a lease agreement. In the event that payment is not made within 5 days of the due date, the tenant will pay the landlord an additional late fee in the amount of $15, right? If this happens, then that other thing happens. If rent is more than 5 days late, 5 or more days late, then the tenant pays a $15 late fee. And so you're going to see, again, I think if you become a lawyer, then in law school and in your legal career, you're going to be dealing with a lot of rules, right? Laws, contracts, things like that. A lot of things that are rules. So the LSAT, conditional logic, gives the LSAT a very direct way to test our ability to understand a rule and understand the implications of the rule, the inferences that are based on that rule. So this is why you need to learn conditional logic on the LSAT. This is why it's tested on the LSAT. It's testing your ability to understand a rule and understand the implications of a rule. Another way to say that, when we talk about inferences and implications, another way to say that is, if we give a rule or a set of rules, conditional logic gives the LSAT, the test writers, a convenient and effective way to test your understanding of, based on this rule or based on this set of rules, what else must be true, what cannot be true, what might or might not be true. And, if we boil it down to kind of like the most simple explanation possible, this is really what a lot of questions on the LSAT are testing in one way or another: your ability to understand what must be true, what cannot be true, what might or might not be true, what could be true. Okay. So one of the things that is challenging when we start talking about conditional logic is conditional statements sound a lot like phrases that we use all the time in everyday conversation. They sound a lot like phrases, like expressions that we use all the time in everyday conversation, but their meaning on the LSAT is very different. And this is what we need to be aware of. This is what we need to be thinking about. So for example, maybe a friend of yours texts you and says, "Hey, are you going to the party tonight?" And you text back and you say, "Sure, yeah, I'll go if you go. If you go, I'll go." Right? And then later on, you get a text from your friend and they're like, "Hey, I'm here at the party. Where are you?" And you go, I decided to stay home." So your friend might be a little disappointed at this, but it's not the end of the world, right? The world is not going to fall apart just because you said, "Oh, if you go, I'll go," and then, your friend's there and you're not. But this is not how it works on the LSAT. On the LSAT, we take these things very literally. So if one person says, "If you go, I'll go," and if we know that your friend is at the party, then you must be at the party, right? It's a guaranteed relationship. These if-then statements on the LSAT are guaranteed relationships. So if you go, I'll go means that if your friend is there at the party, we know for certain that you are there at the party, that you didn't just stay home. So again, it's good to be aware of with a lot of things on the LSAT. There's the way that we use these things in everyday conversation, and then there is the very literal meaning of these words and phrases. And in the LSAT, we're generally dealing with these very literal meanings. And once you understand that, it makes it a little bit easier to understand some of these other things we're going to talk about when we talk about conditional logic. All right, again, if y'all have any questions, if you want to have any questions, you can put them in the chat window. You can hop on the mic and stop me and say, "Hey, stop, I have a question about that." Feel free to do that. Okay, so again, even things when we say conditional statements are about guaranteed relationships, about things that must be true, this is even true on the LSAT of things that things that would seem weird in real life, or things that seem totally unrelated, right? So like, an example would be if a statement says, "If Aaron is wearing a hat, then Raul is eating a crayon." Okay. It seems really weird, right? But again, on the LSAT, we just accept this, as even though there seems to be like no relation between these things, and this would be really weird in everyday life. If we get a statement like this, the LSAT gives us a statement that says, "If Aaron is wearing a hat, then Raul is eating a crayon." And if we know that Aaron is wearing a hat, Aaron comes walking in wearing a hat, we don't even need to know where Raul is. We don't even need to see him. We know that Raul is, eating a crayon, munching down on a sky blue Crayola crayon or whatever. So again, it seems kind of weird, but this is the way we need to think about if-then statements. This is the way we need to think about conditional statements on the LSAT. Even if it seems strange or just doesn't make sense to us when we see these if-then statements, these conditional statements, we want to just accept them as true, that if one thing is true, the other thing must be true. If the if part is true, then the then part must be true. And this is why it actually helps to think about real world examples when we're working with conditional logic. So I'm going to do a lot of, like, for the rest of this, I'm going to do a lot of real world examples, things that we know are factually true. So like this kind of an example, if someone is in New York City, then they are in the USA, right? It's like, okay, you think about that, and yeah, that's true. If somebody's in New York City, then they're in the USA. That makes a little more sense, right, than Aaron and Raul here. Like, we know that that is factually true. If this part is true, if you call me up and say, hey, I'm in New York City, or you text me and say, hey, what's going on? I'm in New York. Okay, I know it must be true that you're, geographically in the US. And thinking about these kind of examples, these real world examples, can help us understand conditional logic a little better. So let's talk about the parts of a conditional statement. There are two parts to a conditional statement. The if part is called the sufficient condition. And the reason we call it the sufficient condition is because that by itself, that if part by itself, is sufficient to guarantee the other thing. So what we mean by sufficient, like, it all by itself is enough to guarantee the other thing. So again, if you text me and you're like, hey, Scott, I'm in New York City, that by itself is enough for me to know that, geographically you are in the US. I don't need to know that you're in New York City and you're on, Fifth Avenue. I don't need to know that you're in New York City and you're seeing a play or whatever. All I need to know is that you're in New York City. That by itself is sufficient for me to know that you're in the US. That's why we call it the sufficient condition. Sometimes we call this the trigger, right? And that alone, being in New York City, is enough to trigger me knowing that you are in the US. The other part, the then part, what we call the then part, is the necessary condition. So again, it is necessary. We call it the necessary condition because if the trigger occurs, if someone is in New York City, in order for that to happen, it is necessary for them to be in the USA. It is necessary for them to, geographically be in the USA. That must happen. Necessary, required, must happen. There's no way we could have this thing happening, the sufficient condition happening, without the necessary condition. And again, it's easy to kind of, see this when we're looking at a real world example, like, New York City being in the US. But we need to remember that any conditional statement that we see on the LSAT works this way, even if, just like conceptually, it doesn't make sense to you. If Aaron is wearing a hat, Raul is eating a crayon. Again, Aaron wearing a hat, we see Aaron wearing a hat. That by itself is sufficient to let us know that somewhere, wherever Raul is eating a crayon. Anytime Aaron puts that hat on, boom, Raul eats a crayon. Reminds me of an episode of The Office that my friend and I were looking at a while ago, but we don't need to get into that. Okay. So we're going to get a little nerdy here. Again, if you have questions about any of this, please jump in and let me know. But this is really important. When we talk about sufficient condition, necessary condition, this the part that's really important here is realizing that the if part by itself is enough to produce this result. We don't need to know anything else. The necessary part is always going to happen whenever this sufficient part happens. Okay, so we're going to get a little nerdy here. Yes, I am a nerd, and I am very proud to call myself a nerd. If you're studying for so this is like May 2024 right now. Logic games, the logic games section on the LSAT's about to go away. But if you have been studying logic games, you may recognize this T-shirt I'm wearing and my little toy dinosaur there. That may remind you of a certain logic game, and that'll tell you what my favorite logic game is. Yes, that's how much of a nerd I am. That's how much of an LSAT nerd I am. I have a favorite logic game. Um, you get bonus points, 1,000 bonus points if in the chat window you can tell us which logic game this is. The points I give away in this class today are not good for anything, by the way, so I give them away very generously. Everybody gets 1,000 points just for being here tonight. And yeah, if you know which logic game this is, put it in the chat window for an extra 1,000 points. Anyway, like I said, we're going to get a little nerdy here. And what I mean by that is I'm going to talk about some things that are very technical when we talk about conditional logic. They're not things that you must know, but if you understand what I'm about to tell you in the next minute or two, that actually will make it a lot easier to understand conditional logic. These are some really specific things that are going to make it a little bit easier for you to understand if you remember them. It's not the end of the world if you don't, though. So we talk about sufficient conditions and necessary conditions. We were just talking about the if part of a conditional statement being the sufficient condition, the then part being the necessary condition. So sufficient condition and necessary condition are actually standard terms in logic, right? So they're standard terms in logic. I'll see what's in the chat window. You just started a few weeks ago. Oh, that's great. You're not that familiar with what the hell, what the heck are you talking about, Scott? You're not that familiar with logic. Totally, no problem at all. Yeah, no problem at all. And if you just started, honestly, this is great that you're here. If you just started studying for the LSAT and you're here learning about conditional logic, hopefully this is helpful. And hopefully, we're throwing a lot of stuff at you in a hurry, but hopefully as you start getting more and more into studying the LSAT, some of this stuff is going to be clicking. You'll remember some of this stuff, and it'll help you as you start working with questions that involve this, that deal with this. And again, you'll get that PDF too that I can send you that, you can go back through and review if you want to remember some of these concepts. So anyway, sufficient condition and necessary condition are standard terms in logic. And the LSAT will actually use those terms. You will see, for example, the sufficient condition and necessary confuses a condition that is sufficient for a result to occur with a condition that is necessary, right? You'll see that appear in some answer choices. There also, unfortunately, we have started using these terms sufficient assumption and necessary assumption. And this goes way back in, studying for the LSAT, that we started using these terms, or, prep companies, teachers, tutors started using these terms sufficient assumption and necessary assumption to explain certain types of questions that appear in logical reasoning. And this is kind of unfortunate that we chose this same language, because this can get a little confusing. And what I want you to do, what I'm going to suggest that you do, I'm going to highly recommend that you build a wall in your brain between sufficient condition and necessary condition, and sufficient assumption and necessary assumption. Because often I'm talking to people, like in a class, or I'm tutoring someone, they will start talking, they'll be asking me questions like, well, what is this sufficient assumption, necessary assumption? What does this mean when we're talking about conditional logic, or vice versa? And if we get really incredibly nerdy, yes, there is a connection between them, but you don't need to know that connection in order to do well on the LSAT. And honestly, I think if you're studying for the LSAT, it is best if you think of these things as completely different. So if you just tell yourself sufficient condition and necessary condition, yes, they're the same words, but they're totally different and have no relation whatsoever with sufficient assumption and necessary assumption. Just tell yourself that these are completely different things. Sufficient condition, necessary condition, that's conditional logic. Sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, that's something totally different. Just forget that it's even the same word. Try to completely keep these things separate in your mind. And I think it's just easier to deal with. Don't even worry about what is the connection. Just happens to be the same words, right? Just like row, a row of houses, and row a boat. I mean, they're not really, that happens to be the same word, but they mean completely different things, right? It's kind of the same thing here. Okay. Another thing, again, incredibly nerdy, but it's good to keep this in mind. Some people will read, again, so we do these little shorthand diagrams, right? These little if-then diagrams. So if someone is in New York City, then they are in the USA. And when we're looking at these little diagrams, the left side is always the sufficient condition. We use this little arrow shorthand diagram. This, by the way, is what we call diagramming. In case I haven't been clear enough, this is what we call diagramming a conditional statement. So when people start talking about diagramming conditional statements, this is what we mean. Instead of writing out the whole sentence, if someone is in New York City, then they are in the USA, we just use this little shorthand. And some people will, when they're reading this, when we write out the shorthand like this, or when they're reading their own notes, their own diagrams, they'll say, New York City, therefore USA, or if New York City, therefore USA. They'll say therefore. And we don't want to do that. Again, this is incredibly nerdy. The world won't come to an end if you say therefore instead of then. But this is really good to keep in mind. Therefore is a conclusion indicator. So, for example, this therefore indicates that there is an argument. So what we would say, here's an example. Scott's dogs are adorable. Yes, these are my two dogs. Scott's dogs are adorable. Therefore, everyone loves Scott's dogs. That's an argument. So when you see this conclusion indicator, therefore, this conclusion may or may not be true. A conclusion, especially when we're talking about the LSAT, it's always good to remember a conclusion is something that may or may not be true. The evidence, the premise or premises are supposed to convince you that the conclusion is true, but we never accept a conclusion on the LSAT as just automatically true. But that's what therefore indicates. It indicates a conclusion, something that may or may not be true. Whereas when we're talking about conditional statements, if you are in New York City, then you are in the US, that is something that will always be true. That is a guaranteed relationship. So we always want to say, again, when we're reading these little diagrams, these little if-then diagrams to represent conditional statements, it is more correct, and we should say, if New York City, then USA. Say then, not therefore. And again, the reason I'm mentioning this is because it really does help to keep these things straight in your mind. It really does help. The world's not going to come to an end, but the more you're clear about these things, the more you understand some of the underlying concepts, and that gets really helpful. So another thing we want to remember is that conditional statements don't necessarily indicate anything about time or about the order of events. So here's what I mean. If we have a conditional statement, maybe this is like two people are speaking at a conference, right? And we say, if Smith speaks on Wednesday, then Rivera will speak on Thursday. So it just so happens that in this conditional statement, we're talking about something happening first, then something happening second. But that's not automatically or necessarily the way conditional statements work. It would be totally fine to say, if Smith speaks on Wednesday, then Rivera speaks on Tuesday. Even though the then part, the necessary condition, is happening before the sufficient condition, that's totally fine. This is still a correct conditional statement, right? It's defining a definite relationship between these two things. If we find out that Smith is speaking on Wednesday, based on this statement, we know that Rivera must be speaking on Tuesday. Or if it's already Wednesday, if this statement is true, if Smith speaks on Wednesday, Rivera speaks on Tuesday. If it's already Wednesday and we see Smith speaking, we know that Rivera spoke the day before. Again, it's a definite relationship and not a guaranteed relationship, not a chronological one. Okay, so again, good thing to keep on. People get confused. I was just talking to somebody earlier today who's, had this question or was not totally sure about this. We want to be clear. It's not describing a chronological relationship. Just if one thing is true, the other thing must also be true. Another example, prerequisites, right? So chemistry 101 is a prerequisite for chemistry 201. So if we were diagramming this in if then, we would say, if you are taking chemistry 201, then you must have first taken chemistry 101, right? Chemistry 101 is a prerequisite. It means if you're taking 201, then you must already have taken 101. but this isn't the order that it's going to happen in, right? The prerequisite happens chronologically first. So we just want to keep that in mind. We're not talking about the order of events here, just this thing requires the other. Also, when we talk about causation, causal relationships show up a lot on the LSAT. And again, causation and conditional logic are not the same. If we, have a statement that says eating raw meat causes food poisoning, right? Eating raw meat causes food poisoning. We're not going to diagram that as if then. If we eat raw meat, then we get food poisoning. I see people do this sometimes, and it actually, there are some LSAT questions I've seen where this could cause you to choose an incorrect answer. If you're trying to diagram things out, diagram some things in the stimulus, diagram some answer choices, and you confuse causation with conditional logic, that can actually lead you astray. So a causal relationship is not necessarily a conditional relationship. And a conditional relationship is not necessarily a causal relationship. Even if eating raw meat does cause food poisoning, it's possible to eat raw meat and not get food poisoning, right? It's not, whereas a conditional relation, that's the way causal relationships work. It's possible to have the cause without the effect, even if there is a causal relationship. Conditional relationships are always going to happen. So we're not going to, it would not be correct to use our little conditional diagram in this case. We're not going to do it that way. All right. So not correct. Causal relationships and conditional relationships are not the same. Okay. So we've just been talking about some common, kind of hopefully clarifying some common misunderstandings about conditional logic, some things that people, again, if you understand everything that we just talked about, then you have a really clear understanding of what conditional logic is, how these conditional statements work, what these conditional statements are actually telling us. That's what we're getting. That's what this first part has been all about. So another thing we need to be aware of is errors in conditional reasoning, common errors that you want to be familiar with and you want to understand how they work, because the LSAT is very often going to test your understanding of these errors or these conditional flaws, flawed conditional reasoning. And they're going to try to trick you with these errors on questions. So we can say, we know it's factually true that if you're in New York City, then you are geographically in the US, you're in the USA. So it's not correct to say that if you are not in New York City, then you are not in the USA, right? That's not correct. I'm not in New York City right now. I'm in Durham, North Carolina, but I am in the USA. So we know this isn't correct, just factually, right? Does anybody know, what do we call this? Do you know the name of this conditional logic error, conditional logic flaw? What do we call this? It's okay if you're not sure. Again, if you're just really new to the LSAT, you may not have learned this yet. We call this an illegal negation. So we can't just take a conditional statement and negate one part or negate both parts and get something that is also true, right? If we take this original statement, which is true, or if we're given this conditional statement, if they tell us, hey, if this happens, then that happens, we can't just negate those things and come up with something that is also true. So that's an illegal negation. And these can seem really tricky when we start getting to LSAT questions and they're throwing a bunch of words at you and you're trying to answer this question in like, a minute and a half. When they throw, answer choices at you that seem to have the correct words in them, you really need to watch out for is it saying, yes, I am in New York City, or no, I'm not in New York City. So another way to think about this is that conditional statements only matter when the sufficient condition is triggered. This is another way to understand illegal negations and why illegal negations don't work. Conditional statements only matter when the sufficient condition is triggered. So if I know that if I'm in New York City, then I am in the USA, If I'm not in New York City, then it's not triggering my sufficient condition of being in New York City. Being in New York City and not being in New York City are two totally different things. So again, with real world examples, maybe this makes it kind of makes sense. But again, we need to remember any conditional statement we see on the LSAT is going to work this way. So for example, going back to our earlier example, if a can is dented, then the price will be discounted by 50%. So if dented, then 50% discount. So if we're given this as a rule, if this is something like, let's say on a logical reasoning question, if this is a statement in the stimulus, this is stated in the stimulus, then what if a can is not dented? And by the way, in case you're not sure, when we're saying not, we put a little like minus sign. Sometimes we use a little tilde. Sometimes we just cross the thing out. Any of those mean not. So I'm just going to use little minus signs here for not. So what if a can is not dented? Based on this statement, if a can is dented, then the price will be discounted by 50%. Okay, well, this can isn't dented. What do we know? What do we know about that can that's not dented? What do you think? Yeah. Well, let's look at it this way. So if I say, hey, everyone who likes ice cream likes candy, again, that may or may not be factual. Oh, I like what you just wrote there yeah. I love what you just wrote there in the chat window. Not 50%, then is it dented? Okay, we'll get to that in a second. That's great. So let's imagine I give you a statement, whether it's factually true or not, but let's say if everyone who likes ice cream likes candy, if someone likes ice cream, then they like candy. Well, what if they don't like ice cream? Do we know anything? What we really want to remember when it comes to conditional logic is that these are talking about two totally different groups of people. Two totally different groups of people. This first statement is telling us about people who do like ice cream. This second statement is about people who don't like ice cream. Two totally different groups of people. So if I give you this, like, let's say as a rule or as a piece of information, if people like ice cream, then they like candy. Well, I'm telling you about this group over here. And that doesn't tell us anything at all about a totally different group of people. So that's one way that helps us, kind of keep this straight. This group and, the people who are something and people who are not something, we're describing two totally different groups. And just because we know something about one of those groups, it does not mean that we know anything about the other group. So, like another example, my family and I visit Sunset Beach every year. So this statement is telling us something about me and the people in my family. Based on this statement, we don't know anything at all about people who are not in my family. Maybe they go to Sunset Beach every year. Maybe they don't. We just don't know. So we really need to keep this straight. Again, conditional statements are telling us about something definite about one group. We don't know anything about people or things that are outside of that group or in a different group. So again, if a can is dented, then the price will be discounted by 50%. If a can is not dented, we don't know. If a can is not dented, maybe it's going to be discounted by 50%. Maybe it's not. We don't know. So this statement, this original statement up here, our original conditional statement, does not tell us anything about cans that are not dented. We can't make any kind of inference or draw any conclusion about cans that are not dented. We just don't know. Okay. And again, this all gets down to, illegal negations. We also can't just reverse a conditional statement. We can't just reverse a conditional statement. So if I say, if I tell you, if someone is in New York City, then maybe you're an alien from another planet. You've never been to Earth before. You have no idea about New York City. And I'm saying, okay, if you're in New York City, then you're in the USA. You can't flip that around and say, oh, so then if you're in USA, then you're in New York City. That doesn't work. That's not true. Again, I am in the USA right now, but I'm not in New York City. What is this called? It's an illegal negation. Oh, sorry, that's an illegal reversal. Whoops, gotta fix my slide. Okay, yeah, this is an illegal reversal. Illegal reversal. The one we showed you before was an illegal negation. This is an illegal reversal. You can't just reverse a conditional state. Here, let me fix this in Zoom. Nah, I'm not going to bother fixing it in Zoom. Yes, I am. I'm going to do it. I'm going to fix it. We're going to cross this out. Ah, it's not an illegal negation. For posterity, it is an illegal reversal. So illegal reversal, invalid reversal, we're not allowed to just reverse a conditional statement. If I give you one conditional statement, you can't just reverse it and come up with something that is also true. That doesn't work. Okay. Okay, so what can we infer? If I give you, we just spent a lot of time talking about conditional logic errors. If I give you this conditional statement, then you don't know this other thing. Well, what do you know? If I give you a certain conditional statement, what do you know? So here's an example. If someone is in British Columbia, then they're in Canada. If you're in British Columbia, then you must be in Canada. That's factually true, right? If you're not sure where British Columbia is, or if you've never been to British Columbia or never been to Canada, I'm just going to give you this to you as a statement. If you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada. So what if you're not in Canada? What do we know? Boom, you're not in British Columbia, right? If you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada. So if you're not in Canada, then you can't be in British Columbia. What is this called? And just you're in the chat window. Yeah, when you said not 50%, then yeah,
Oh,
you're
is
in
it
you're
the illegal negation?
No, this is, it looks like an illegal negation, maybe, right? Because we did we are negating, but notice we didn't just negate both sides. An illegal negation would be if you're not in British Columbia, then you're not in Canada. That would be an illegal, so good question. That would be an illegal negation. I'm going to show you an illegal negation so you can see the difference. Let me put it up here on the screen. An illegal negation would be not British Columbia. Oops, don't want to use equal signs. We want to use arrows. Not British Columbia, then not. If you're not in British Columbia, then you are not in Canada. That would be an illegal negation. That's an illegal negation. And anybody who's watching this in Quebec right now is shaking their fist at me, right? Like, this isn't true. If you're not in British Columbia, then you're not in Canada. You could be in Toronto or Montreal or a lot of other places that are not British Columbia, and you could still be in Canada. That's the illegal negation. This, what we had on the screen, is called the contrapositive. Contrapositive. So this is an actual, this is okay. This is an actual inference that we can draw. Anytime you're given a conditional statement, and it can be about British Columbia and Canada, or it can be about cans and dents, anytime you're given a conditional statement, if you reverse both sides, so we switch the sides, boom, we switch them around. Notice Canada was over here in the necessary condition. Now Canada is in the sufficient condition. British Columbia sufficient condition, now it's in the necessary condition. But we didn't just reverse them. We reverse and negate together. Then we come up with something that is true. Then we come up with something that is true. That's called the contrapositive. So we can't just reverse. We can't just negate. But if we reverse and negate, then we come up with something else that must be true. Good. Thumbs up in the, we got Zoom thumbs up here. Cool. Okay. So again, going along with what you wrote in the chat window earlier, I said you're on the right track. If a can is dented, the price will be discounted by 50%. If we reverse and negate that, we get, if it's not discounted by 50%, then it is not dented. Okay. So another thing we can do, another fun thing we can do with conditional inferences is we can combine conditional statements. So if we say, if you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada. If you're in Canada, then you're in North America, right? Happens to be true. Well, notice that when the end of one conditional statement perfectly matches the beginning of another, when the necessary condition of one conditional statement perfectly matches the other. Remember, these are about definite relationships, guaranteed relationships. So if you're in British Columbia, you must be in Canada. And if you're in Canada, you must be in North America. So we can combine these and say, if you're in British Columbia, then you are in North America. We can just skip over the middle. We don't even have to include the middle. This is this is what we would call an inference, a conclusion that we can draw by combining these two conditional statements. Again, if you were an alien from another planet, and I told you if you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada, and if you're in Canada, then you're in North America. If I told you those two things and you were an alien from another planet and you'd never been to Earth before, if you understood conditional logic, you would be able to tell me, you would know that then if you're in British Columbia, then you're in North America. Okay. Now we have to be careful, though. We have to be careful that our statements line up exactly. So if we said, if you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada. If you're not in Canada, then you're not subject to Canadian law, let's say. There's no connection between these things. We can't connect them. We can't connect a Canada in one with a not Canada at the beginning of another. We can't connect Canada at the end of one statement with not Canada at the other. Because again, we're talking about two different things, being in Canada, being not in Canada. Those are two totally separate groups, two totally separate things. We can't combine them. Okay, so let's do a little pop quiz here. I'm going to leave this up for a second. I'm going to be quiet for a moment and see if maybe if you have a little scrap paper with you or whatever you're using to take notes, if you're taking notes, see if you can come up with any inferences based on this information. I'll go ahead and be quiet for a moment and let y'all try this out. Okay, so let's give this a shot. For the top one, we can do our contrapositives, right? Our contrapositives that we just did. If R, then Q means if not Q, then not R. Or we can take if J, then not Q and turn that into Q, then not J. And if we do either one of those, then we can combine. We can say if R, then not Q, and if Q, then not J. And we get if R, then not J. Or if J, then not Q, and if Q, not Q, then not R. If J, then not R. So these are sometimes, and this is what the LSAT's going to test sometimes, like in must be true questions, maybe. They might test your ability to actually look at some conditional statements and say, oh, if I do the contrapositive here of one of these, I then can combine them together. By doing the contrapositive, I get the necessary condition of one matching the sufficient condition of another, and then I can combine them together and just skip out that middle part. Okay, and for our second one, our next one. Now this is kind of cool because we already have the sufficient condition of one matching the necessary condition of another. So we can just link these together. And we get if H then not M and if M then not H. So again, this is what sometimes some questions are going to test your ability to do is sometimes just see the link that's already there. Sometimes you might need to do a little contrapositive. So remember, contrapositive, if, and I may have gone through this quickly, so I want to make sure this is clear. If a conditional statement is true, the contrapositive must also be true. If a conditional statement is true, the contrapositive must also be true. I just want to, just because this is one of those maybe fundamental things. Remember I said people like sometimes gloss over things. I did gloss over that kind of quickly. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. If it's true, again, I tell my alien friends that if you're in British Columbia, then you're in Canada. Again, if they may have never been to Earth, but they'll know, if they know conditional logic, that if you're not in Canada, it must also be true that if you're not in Canada, you're not in British Columbia. If one conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive must also be true. And you can just switch back and forth between a conditional statement and its contrapositive all day long. If one is true, the other one must also be true, as long as you're doing the correct contrapositive. All right. And again, sometimes we're going to need to do that. The LSAT's going to test our ability to do that in order to link statements together and make inferences. Okay. So we got a few more things to go through here. Language. So how do we take, one of the things the LSAT's going to test is your ability to recognize, look at it, read a sentence and recognize that it is actually conditional. So the word if by itself indicates the beginning of the sufficient condition. If a town is in British Columbia, then it is in Canada. And it doesn't matter where if is in the sentence. And this confuses people a little bit sometimes because people will look at this bottom sentence, a town is in Canada if it is in British Columbia, and they want to put, Canada on this side of the arrow and British Columbia on that side of the arrow, but it's not. We really have to pay attention to that word if. And it doesn't matter where the word if is in the sentence. These two sentences mean the same thing. So when we start our sufficient condition, our left side of the arrow, we always start with if and then what is immediately after if. So these two sentences mean the exact same thing, and we would diagram them the same way. We would diagram both of these sentences as British Columbia, arrow, Canada. If in British Columbia, then in Canada. Only if means something different from the word if. They're not the same. A town is in North Carolina only if it is in the USA. A town is in North Carolina only if it is in the USA. So a town in North Carolina must be in the USA. So only if basically, so if in North Carolina, then USA. If North Carolina, then USA. So another example, I can sign into a website only if I have the correct password. Okay, so if I can sign into the website, then I have the correct password. Right? So basically what we're saying here is only if just means then. That phrase only if is different from if. If starts our sufficient condition. Only if is the then in the sentence. Only if is the arrow. We can replace the phrase only if with our conditional arrow. We would just read if North Carolina, then USA. So again, if, only if, two completely different things, completely different meanings. We also have biconditional statements. Biconditionals are, it's basically just both. So Lauren eats soup if and only if she is at her favorite restaurant. So a way to understand this is just we have those two conditional logic indicator words, right? If, and then we have an only if. We have two, the word if and then the phrase only if. So what do we do with this? Well, we just look at one at a time. Lauren eats soup if she is at her favorite restaurant. If she is at her favorite restaurant, then she eats soup. Right? So we can diagram it that way. Well, now let's look at the other side, the only if side. Lauren eats soup only if she is at her favorite restaurant. So we would diagram that as if soup, then favorite restaurant. So what do we get when we combine them together? We get both. If Lauren eats soup, then she is at her favorite restaurant. If Lauren is at her favorite restaurant, then she eats soup. It's basically two different conditional statements. And you're looking at this, maybe if you're really into the conditional logic errors, you're going, wait a minute, that's an illegal reversal, right? But it's not, because they're explicitly telling us this. This would be a statement that they're explicitly giving us, if and only if. This would be like a statement in a stimulus of a must be true question, or this could be something you would see in an answer choice. So if they explicitly say it's both, then it's okay that, the statement works both ways. What some people will do is they'll use a double-headed arrow. So instead of writing out the two statements separately, they use a little double-headed arrow. That works fine if you prefer that. you like to, if we're having to diagram these in our notes, as we're on a scrap paper, as we're working on a question, you can do it either way. I'll usually keep them separate like this just because that sometimes works easier for me. Okay, unless another weird conditional logic, this is something people struggle with a little bit when we're talking about conditional logic. And it looks like we're going to go a little bit over an hour. I try to usually keep this to an hour, but we're actually going to go over a little bit. So if you have to sign off at the hour, totally fine. Thank you for being here. I will send everybody a link to this video, and you can watch the last few minutes. But I want to go ahead and, usually I try to keep things right, keep the time exactly as scheduled. But I'm going to go ahead and just finish this up. It'll take a couple extra minutes. We'll be a little bit longer than an hour this time. So unless I cannot sign into the website unless I have the correct password. So this is actually conditional. This is telling us about a guaranteed thing, right? Something that a guaranteed relationship. So one way we can deal with unless is we can turn the word unless. This also works with until. We can turn it into, there are actually a few words that work, phrases that work the same way as unless. Unless, until, if not, unless, until, without. And we can turn all those into if not. And this gets a little bit grammatically weird, but if you're just diagramming, if you're not saying this out loud and you're just diagramming it, it actually makes a lot of sense. So if is the start of our sufficient condition. If not, I have the correct password, or if I don't have the correct password, then I cannot sign into the website. And we would just diagram that this way. If I don't have the correct password, then I cannot sign in. So this is one way we can turn an unless. This is method one of turning an unless statement into a simple if-then statement, or into our little if-then shorthand, conditional logic shorthand, conditional logic diagram. If I don't have the correct password, then I cannot sign in. That's method one. We replace unless, until, without. We replace those with the phrase if not. Another method is we need to make two changes, and this works better for some people. We can take the word unless or until or without, and we can just turn it into then. Just replace that with then. But then we have to negate the first part. So negate, it means I cannot sign into the website becomes I can sign into the website. If we do that, we can replace the word unless or until or without. We can just replace that with then. We can replace that with our arrow. And we get, if I can sign into the website, then I have the correct password. So these are two different methods. You don't necessarily need to know both. I know how to do both because I teach this stuff. But if you're just studying for the LSAT, you're not actually teaching it. If one of these method one or method two work better for your brain, you can actually just use that method and forget the other one exists if you want. The reason is because if you notice, when we use method one, we get this. If you don't have the correct password, then you can't sign in. If we use method two, we get if you do sign in, then you must have the correct password. What's the relationship between these two statements? What's the relationship between these two conditional statements? Put it in the chat window for 1,000 points if you remember. Contrapositive, right?
Contrapositive.
Yeah, contrapositive. So remember, a statement and it's contrapositive. If one is true, the other must be true. You can switch back and forth between those all day long, just reversing and negating. So this is why you can use either method one or method two and use whichever one works best for you. Then if you need to, you can just reverse and negate if you need to get something different. Okay, another conditional, sentences, real world sentences, English sentences that we have to translate into if then that give people confusion is negative statements that begin with a negative word like no, none, never, things like that. Anytime it begins with a negative like no. So here's an example. No employee of Acme Inc. works on a Saturday. And the way that I translate these is I call it the Schoolhouse Rock method. Remember Schoolhouse Rock? Noun. Noun is a person, place, or thing. So we start reading the sentence and we look for the first noun, the first person, place, or thing in the sentence, which in this case is employee of Acme Inc. I make that my sufficient condition. So, okay, if I'm an employee of Acme, that's my sufficient condition. If I am an employee of Acme, and then I step back and say, okay, what is this whole sentence telling me about myself? If I'm an employee of Acme, then what? Oh, then I don't work on Saturday. Boom, we have our necessary condition. We have our if then statement. If you are an employee of Acme, then you do not work on Saturday. So this is a way to, again, I call it the Schoolhouse Rock method. You look at this negatively phrased sentence, you look for the first person, place, or thing, you make that your sufficient condition. And it's a positive. You're not negating the sufficient condition. You're just saying, if I am an employee of Acme, then what does the whole sentence tell me about me? I don't work on Saturday. If employee of Acme, then not work on Saturday. That is our if then statement. Okay. What's next? So we're going to wrap this up. We're going to talk about one last concept, and then we're going to call this a night. Thank you all for sticking around. I hope this is helpful for you. I hope this is making some sense. Okay, so we're going to talk about compound conditional statements. Compound conditional statements are conditional statements that have conjunctions in them, basically. Again, Schoolhouse Rock, right? Conjunction, junction, ors and ands. So if A, then B or C. If A, then B and C. If X or Y, then Z. If X and Y, then Z. These are all what we call compound conditional statements. There's an or an and in one side or the other, sufficient condition or necessary condition. So the big thing we need to know about with these is we need to know what to do with them. Specifically, contrapositives. The most common thing you're going to have to do with these, or the tricky thing, I guess, is if you need to figure out what the contrapositive is. And it's actually not that complicated. Remember, how do we get a contrapositive? We reverse the statements, we swap the sides, we negate both sides. So it's the same thing we're going to do here. The one other step is we're going to switch the conjunction. So or becomes and becomes or. So if A, then B or C, contrapositive is if not B and not C, then not A. And you can see these other examples here. Again, they're all the same. We reversed, we negated, we switched and for or. And this is one of those things, I think there are certain things with conditional logic, certain things we've already talked about tonight that are, it helps to just treat them as rules, right? If you just treat this thing as a rule and say, yeah, I'm just always going to I'm going to memorize the rule and I'm just going to follow the rule. That works really good with conditional logic with a lot of these things. But sometimes it does help to reason your way through it. So, for example, I like to use my Aunt Marie. She's in her 90s. She makes fantastic lasagna. And this real deal here, true statement. To make lasagna using my Aunt Marie's recipe, I need homemade meatballs and lots of garlic. So notice this is conditional, right? If I make Aunt Marie's lasagna, then it is required to have meatballs and garlic. Well, what if I don't have homemade meatballs or I don't have garlic? What if I don't have one thing or the other? If I don't have one thing or the other, then I can't make Aunt Marie's lasagna. So there you go. Real world example using Aunt Marie's lasagna of contrapositive of a complex conditional statement. So again, sometimes this is kind of what I'm going to leave you with. Sometimes with conditional logic, it really helps. You kind of have your list of all these conditional rules and, concepts that you need to remember. And it really helps to just do what I did with this slide. Sit down for yourself and make, get a blank notepad or open up a Word document or whatever and write out some conditional statements using this different language. Write some conditional statements using and or. Write some conditional statements using unless. Like write out some actual sentences. I mean, some actual like if then sentences or unless sentences or no sentences. No, this is that. And then try to translate them into simple if then form. Right. And do it with things that you know are true, like geographical, like cities and states, or like sit in your house and think about things that are true around you in the house, like if something is in the refrigerator, then it is in the kitchen, things like that. But you'd be surprised. It's a really good way to like review these concepts and really cement them in your head and understand how they work is by just taking things that you know to be true and writing them out using this language, this conditional language, if then or unless or not. Write them out this way and see if that helps you wrap your head around this stuff. But hopefully this our little class today was helpful. Again, this is kind of a whirlwind tour. It's a crash course. That's why we call it a crash course, because we just covered a lot of stuff in a short period of time. But I am, for those of you who signed up for this course and joined us here today, or just signed up and weren't able to join us, I am going to send you a couple things. I'll send you a link to the recording, so you can go back and rewatch it if you want. And I will send you that PDF that I mentioned in the beginning, that handout that I created, Guide to Conditional Logic. So look for an email from me, from Scott@scottmillercoaching.com. You can also, if you want, go to my website, scottmillercoaching.com/LSAT. And there are several different videos there, LSAT related videos, some stuff about blind review, some other things that I put up on there every once in a while. So there's there are a few free LSAT resources there. There's a podcast episode, a link to a podcast episode with a friend of mine, Graham Downey, who's a lawyer now. He graduated from Yale Law School. He's a lawyer. And he was an LSAT instructor for a while. I worked with him for a while, and he has a 180 on the LSAT. So I did a cool podcast episode with him where we just talked about it's actually about time management and lessons that the LSAT can teach you about like real life. So if that sounds interesting, again, all this stuff is on my website, scottmillercoaching.com/LSAT. That's all we got, folks. Thank you all. Thanks for being here tonight. If you're watching this on the video, thanks for watching the video. Yeah, you can shoot me an email if you have questions about any of this stuff. And yeah, that's all we got. Happy LSATing. Good luck with this stuff.